and welcome back to Reflecting Shakespeare TV, Response Edition, Episode 5. My name is Erika, and I'm the manager and facilitator for the Reflecting Shakespeare program that we've been bringing inside to people experiencing incarceration since 2016, and which has been very active during this COVID pandemic through this program, Reflecting Shakespeare TV, and also through an in-cell activity packet delivered like a correspondence course to all of the facility's yards over at Centinela. So that correspondence course followed the play Much Ado About Nothing, just like we did in Series 3 of Reflecting Shakespeare TV. Before we get deeper into that, come on, let's bring on my co-hosts, James and Niki. Come on, you two. Woo! Hey!
Here we are.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. We are back bringing the voices of our guys from all of our folks. So, yes, excited.
That is awesome. Great to see everyone. Hey, everyone, I'm so glad to be here and looking forward to hearing more from the Reflecting Shakespeare crew out at Centinela.
Oh, yes. And with this episode, we are going to wrap it all up. But before we do, I want to remind all of our audience that the folks reading these incredible responses from inside are our network of formerly incarcerated artists who have been guest hosting with us for episodes 1 through 10 of Series 3, and also all of our episodes in Series 2. So we're so grateful to have them along. And on their behalf, I want to express that they've all expressed to me personally how exciting it's been for them to give back and to reach out and to honor the voices of the folks inside. We've been wrapping up our recording sessions with their saying, I get it. I wish I could just go back with you and let these folks know how much I want to honor what they're doing in their endeavors inside. So throwing that back at you. So, all right, let's wrap it up with an incredible session here of some more writing as we get to the end of exploring Much Ado About Nothing.
All right. So in episode 9, Benedict was truly out of his comfort zone. Having given himself over to love, he tries to do things that people who are in love do, like writing love poetry, or even worse, a rhyming love song. And he is terrible at it. He tries out his song to Beatrice in front of the audience and owns up to it being terrible. But that was a really vulnerable place for him to be in. And what's so endearing about that moment is that the audience gets to be that additional character that gets to receive Benedict's vulnerability. And so we posed a fill-in-the-blank style quick write on vulnerability. I perceive vulnerability as, vulnerability makes me feel. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes, usually, when I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been. When I've received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel. And a positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been or might be. Let's hear what we got back.
I perceive vulnerability as when sometimes I express my feelings to others. Vulnerability makes me feel like I left a part of me open. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I'm usually slow to talk about it. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been not that good. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel that I can be open with that person. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been that it can help me to express myself and to not be ashamed.
I perceive vulnerability as being open to indefensible scrutiny. Vulnerability makes me feel naked. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes usually resist it with everything in me. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been violence. When I've received vulnerability and someone has been vulnerable to me, it made me feel sad and vulnerable myself. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been a release of tension.
Vulnerability as a gift. Vulnerability makes me feel good and sad sometimes. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I usually, when I'm humble, When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been not being honest. When I receive vulnerability and someone's vulnerable to me, it made me feel good. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability might be to avoid a problem.
I perceive vulnerability as strength now that I'm educated myself. Being open and knowing my inner peace to show is healing. Vulnerability makes me feel like I have a keen understanding of who I am and how to treat other people. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes usually get caught up in my old way of thinking, caring what others think of me. When I mask vulnerability, an outcome is me hurting someone for fear of being seen as weak. When I perceive vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel like I can be as well. Let that mask of aggression be thrown out. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been me and my wife has become closer than ever. She knows my way of thinking and my communication skills.
I perceive vulnerability as a strength because when a person is willing to be totally exposed, they are open to attack. Vulnerability makes me feel naked and bold with that I dare you stance, with the insane laugh into blowing winds. Ha ha! Come at me. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I usually think about the individuals I'm around because some people aren't where you are intellectually. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been often me being displeased or more often than not climbing through more unnecessary conversations. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel special because they were willing to disarm and engage with me due to seeing the good in me. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been I've been able to heal from a lot of past trauma, and as a result, cultivated a few more healthy relationships.
I perceive vulnerability as being honest. Vulnerability makes me feel exposed. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes think twice. When I receive vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel honored that someone is trusting me. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability might be you get to know the person better.
I perceive vulnerability as, I could probably say, as a weakness or as a defect. Vulnerability makes me feel, I could say, scared, maybe because I'll be exposed to being harmed. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I usually feel vulnerable, I guess. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel I had to do things right, maybe had a change of heart. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been slash might be that I'm not afraid to be myself. It could probably show the real me.
I perceive vulnerability as the most honest of emotions. It's the truth we all suffer. Most of us perceive it as a weakness, but it is a strength. Vulnerability makes me feel insecure, exposed, scrutinized. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes or usually fumble my words or have trouble expressing myself. When I've asked for vulnerability, an outcome is being I've kept my true feelings bottled up and missed opportunities to communicate them. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel like they trusted me enough to keep it 100. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been or might be honesty with yourself and with others, staying true to who you are and having that confidence to wield vulnerability as a strength.
I perceive vulnerability as, I used to perceive vulnerability as a form of weakness. However, there are times when vulnerability opens a line of communication for ourselves. Vulnerability makes me feel exposed to the elements and others.
It scares me and it makes me anxious. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes and usually tell myself that exposing vulnerability helps others. And when I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been mixed. Sometimes it defends against those that have ill intents, and other times it can defeat communication lines with others. When I've received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel trusted and closer to the other person. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability that has happened when I'm sharing with a group of people with the same objective. Well, we all feel the pain of each other and we become more supportive.
I perceive vulnerability as a suit of armor gilded in hardened feathers. Vulnerability makes me feel exposed to that which renders me bare. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I usually don't. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome is being that I have had a soft place to land. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel worthy of trust. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been an opportunity to know unconditional love.
I perceive vulnerability as an inner strength. Vulnerability makes me feel in touch with my emotions and feelings. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes usually open up myself and let others in. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been that I've been stoic without feelings. When I've received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel uncomfortable, though good to have someone open up to me. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability might be being more considerate to others and more approachable.
I perceived vulnerability as a willingness to be open and honest with yourself and others. Vulnerability makes me feel free, free, free. When I'm considering expressing vulnerability, I sometimes usually have to trust the person I'm considering expressing that vulnerability to. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been a ticking time bomb. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel trusted and embraced, and that's a good feeling. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been opening up to a selected group of people I trust. It's been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life.
I perceive vulnerability as a weakness. Vulnerability makes me feel open for attack, but an expression of my trust. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes usually explain in detail what I'm talking about. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been manipulated. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel like they care and are trusting in me. I feel loved. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability might be the strength of my relationship, the glue of trust and loyalty.
I perceive vulnerability as putting yourself out there without walls, being who you truly are without the facade. Vulnerability makes me feel, well, men love to consider themselves strong, so vulnerability makes one feel weak. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I usually think twice because nobody wants to see them naked without the shields. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been bad because I wasn't telling the truth. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel like I was on top of the world. That was the old me. Now when I see this, I recognize that person as being true. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been powerful in getting the truth back in return. It doesn't get better than that.
I perceive vulnerability as having the strength to let someone into your life. Vulnerability makes me feel like others are judging me. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes feel uncomfortable knowing that I'm expressing my true feelings for the first time to another person. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been frightening because I couldn't be myself. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, It made me feel embarrassed because someone had the courage to do what I could not do. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been learning how to handle difficult feelings and the consequences behind them, which gives you spiritual freedom.
I perceive vulnerability as letting my guard off or catching someone slipping. Vulnerability makes me feel as if I'm naked. If I do that, I must be tripping. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I usually end up choking up with a knot in my throat. When I'm masked, vulnerability and outcome has been nothing but success, so I gloat. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel confused and glad to know I was trusted. The positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been that I can express myself freely and feel relief.
I perceive vulnerability as a good thing, a chance to allow others to be a part of your life and get to know the real you. Vulnerability makes me feel human. I feel connected to others. When I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes or usually put my guard down and trust my instincts to trust a person or people I'm opening up to. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been that I missed out on the opportunity to find solutions or strengthen my relationships. When I received vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel good and happy someone trusted me. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been, or might be, that people get to know me for who I am. Relationships with others are far more genuine.
I perceive vulnerability as being human and a pathway to grow as a person if facing fears. Vulnerability makes me feel scared to my bones to be laid out so openly in front of someone. And when I consider expressing vulnerability, I sometimes or usually just do it to not overthink it or try to trick myself into it. When I've masked vulnerability, an outcome has been very painful. When I receive vulnerability and someone was vulnerable to me, it made me feel special and helpful if the person was seeking advice or comments. A positive outcome of expressing vulnerability has been or might be a huge burden being lifted from your soul.
Wow. Well, if that wasn't an enlightening popular prompt, lots of gold right up in there. So as we went deeper into the scenes in episode 9, a story unfolded that presented a possible journey of amends for Claudio, who was feeling terrible to learn that he slandered Hero on false information. And at this point in the story, he believes that heartbreak he caused led Hero to actually die. Claudia is so grateful when Hero's father, Leonardo, offers him a pathway to amends. So this prompts us to ask a journaling question. Why do we let our fears, ego, and masks prevent us from making amends? And what does penitence look like? So let's hear some of these amazing responses from these men inside.
Penitence is waiting for the right moment to make amends with someone that you hurt, while it's still fresh in their heads about what happened.
No one likes to admit that they were wrong, so finding the strength to bridge the gap of communication seems Herculean. We let our fears and ego dominate our senses because somewhere we were taught never to relent, for that was weakness. Penitence is an action word. It is turning away permanently from a thing or a course of conduct that is unjust to another person.
I'm considerate of others' feelings and I'm self-aware. I no longer allow my pride nor ego to be a determining factor of my decision-making. If I'm wrong, I make sure I'm mature and I apologize. Being vigilant of past mistakes comes from past experiences. So now when I know my decision is being driven by emotions or ego, I recognize it as it's happening and I make amends.
Identity and what others think of us plays a big part in why we allow ourselves to crash into brick walls, knowing damn well that's what's ahead will only cause us harm if we don't own it, to be blunt. Penitence Looks like a person giving his all to live amends for his past wrongs by using his knowledge and gifts to better the life of someone, anyone out there in the world. Not because he owes a debt to society, but because he knows it's right to pay it forward whenever possible.
All right, this is the episode 9 reflection. Why do we let our fears, ego, and masks prevent us from making amends? And what does penitence look like?
My father and I never had a great relationship. It was his way or the highway. But once I sobered up and had a family, I bought a house and worked hard. I realized what he was trying to teach me. He even realized I was changing for the best. So when I got arrested for an old case, it broke his heart. So I've been trying to salvage what little I can with him to show him that I could still be the man he wanted me to be.
For me, it was probably because I was scared to accept that I was wrong. Or maybe because my stupid ego and pride didn't want me to take or accept responsibility for my actions. I've lost many good friends due to my pride, ego, and mask getting in the way, and it hurts because this will be something that I have to live with for the rest of my life. Kind of like penitence, feeling sorrow for my wrong.
It all comes down to selfishness. Still thinking it's all about me. That prevents us from making amends. You need empathy to have penitence. And to have empathy, you must step outside yourself. Selfless.
In my life, I have 3 people I need to make amends to. I've yet to have the chance to do so, but over 20 years have elapsed, and I regret that I didn't do what needed to be done to make amends. I allowed my pride to get in the way, and I have learned that pride has always resulted in pain.
I think we wait so long because we're already debating if we want to make it right, or sometimes we don't want to look stupid, so we won't say anything at all.
It is my opinion and my own personal experience that oftentimes we wait until the last possible minute to make amends. Not because we don't want to or we have not repented of our sins or wrongdoing, but because we are afraid our penitence will not be accepted. Penitence to me looks like doing my time and doing it productively.
I let my fears, ego, and masks get in the way from making amends at times because I don't want to face rejection and be hurt or made out to look like a fool. To me, penitence is opening yourself up and wholeheartedly apologizing for what I've done without worrying about what the other person may or may not say.
Well, it's the human thing and condition. It's like always getting the last word in a conversation. No one likes getting the short end of the stick. Pride will always make a person fall, and when it's too late, we recognize it. A poker face will always lead us down the wrong road. No one ever likes to lose, but losing is when we recognize the truth. Amends is valuable, but it only comes when one reaches his or her bottom. Only then will we let go of our ego.
It's the shame behind our actions that can hold us back at times. But we can be so full of pride that we hate to admit we are wrong. We often lie to ourselves and others, making up every possible excuse to justify our actions. We deal with our actions by convincing ourselves we are right to deal with our behavior psychologically. Penitence is admitting when we are wrong, then taking action to correct those wrongs and the negative behavior that caused harm, ultimately committing ourselves to create no more victims.
I believe it mainly correlates to the fear of confrontation or rejection that people wait since they haven't worked up the nerve. I've seen where people act dumb because they won't let their ego or mask come off our way. I knew one guy who would never admit he was wrong. Why? I'm still trying to figure that out to this day. Penitence for me depends on the severity of the crime. From one standpoint, that is really compromised on both sides to leverage guilt with anger, revenge, and a sense of being wronged in general, so both party members feel better in the end. I believe actions speak louder than words. So I try to do surprise grand gestures if I make mistakes for forgiveness.
Put our mask in place because of fear, and it's our ego that prevents us from removing it. This is stubbornness. It echoes back to being vulnerable. If we remove the mask to make amends, we open a floodgate of pain for ourselves and as well as the ones we must make amends to. But it is necessary for our accountability and their healing. Penitence to me is not done by words alone. It is through actions and deeds.
Yeah, amends is a big theme as we head into the end of this play. In episode 10, though, we have a happy ending. Claudio has made his amends to Hero and Leonardo by speaking his regrets over what he thinks is Hero's grave, and then agreeing to Leonardo's scheme to marry another young lady in Leonardo's family. This turns out to be Hero herself. And we get that wedding that we were promised earlier in the play. We even get a wedding engagement from Beatrice and Benedict. From a modern perspective, we all agreed this seemed like an odd way of making things right. But we also agreed that Shakespeare was offering the possibility of a healing amidst all of this trauma caused by the drama of the story. And so we asked, when we think of all that's transpired in this play, when you think of someone that you could make it right with, what would your way of doing that look like? Let's hear some of those responses.
First of all, I will set my pride aside. I will approach the person, if it's possible, admit my fault, accepting responsibility and accountability for my wrong actions. I will then express my true and sincere remorse, seeking all possible ways to best correct my actions and the behavior that caused the harm or wrong.
My way of making it right would look like by first accepting that I was wrong, and by also accepting full responsibility for the pain or wrong that I've caused. Then I would try to make amends in any way possible, showing that person how terribly sorry I am for what I did. And then hopefully be able to do whatever it takes me to do to make things right. When we're wrong, we are wrong. And most of us have to learn how to accept that so that we can make things right. If we don't, we will live a life of loneliness.
I played this scene in my head every night because I have people in my past that I need to make amends to. I always played in my head that I am face to face with the person so he or she can see the sincerity of my apology and regret.
I would ask that person for a moment. I need to talk to them about something. To please give me an opportunity to make this wrong right within you. Then I would be accountable for my actions or hurts and explain humbly and ask for their forgiveness. Then maybe even give them a hug or shake their hand afterwards. I wouldn't want to argue with them either. So if they respond to what I say, I'll just listen with respect and be attentive to what they have to say.
When I think of who I can make it right with, I think of my kids. They shouldn't have spent so many years without a father figure for my mistakes. I would make it right by being there for them, providing for their every need and being a supportive, positive role model. I show them as much love as possible, but me not being there is not the same.
Then I would voice my apology. I would just spill my guts and let the person know how I feel. I would explain that I am not perfect, and though I have good intent, I have many flaws. Not only do I apologize for what I've done, but I also vow to never let this happen again. I'm sad and embarrassed today that I am the reason we are not standing here in a better light.
Looking back at my past behaviors, I made lots of horrific decisions that affected my loved ones. One of the people I would like to reestablish a relationship with would be my ex-girlfriend. To make it right, I would like to sit down with her and have a grown-up conversation. I would be respectful and open to suggestions. I wouldn't put any pressure to make a decision. I would respect her decisions and go on from there.
I think the one of the most difficult things a person can do is make it right. It all depends on how I've wronged the person. But I think that in any case, I would start with a humble apology followed by a dialogue.
Well, the way in always has to be subtle, but the other person's defenses are already up when it comes to you. I think you should just come out and tell the other person you were wrong and accept whatever they say in return. Most people need space to forgive. It doesn't just happen overnight. And even if that person doesn't forgive you, at least you tried to clear the air. And the best part about this is you'll no longer have to carry this around with you.
Wow. It's an important question, right? So lastly, we got to the end of this play and we asked the question that we always ask in person. What is your takeaway from this play? What is the message of value that this play holds for you? So let's hear some of what came back to us.
The message that I'm taking from this play is how the power of changing our negative views, perspective of life can bring true healing when one chooses to let things go, seeking forgiveness as well as giving it. It reminds me of a quote from a book I read. It is not the world that has anything wrong with it. It is the lens by which we view it that's wrong with it. To change this, it requires to change the prescription of our lenses in a positive way of viewing the world. Then we can begin to change ourselves.
Here's what I'll take away: that things are not what they seem, that anyone can bring harm to you, that family is important, love is still alive, and pride can keep you away from what you desire.
Theme when everybody was accusing Hero of being unfaithful, because it showed me how quick we are to judge people. And most of the time we judge without giving them the benefit of the doubt. This also showed me that there's always two sides to a story, and that no matter what, we should always listen to both sides before picking a side to judge. As a takeaway, I will take more time with me that no matter what, we should always be ready to pay for all the wrongs we've done in life. And then we should always think before we act on something, because there's always a choice. As a lesson from the play that resonated with me and why, well, I have to admit that doing things for my benefit has always been a part of my life. Not realizing that I was probably hurting people or maybe destroying relationships just to get my will done. But thanks to this play of Much Ado About Nothing, I've learned that it's not only about me, and I thank you and Shakespeare for that. The story has helped me so much in my transition into becoming a better person in life.
The big takeaway that resonates with me the most is how far someone would go in the lengths of which someone will try to sabotage another person and their relationship. Unlike the play, truth came to light before it went totally wrong for Hero, but life doesn't always play out that way. And it can ruin people's lives if the truth doesn't come out in time.
Basically, it's best to always be honest with your words, deeds, and feelings. Being false with others only leads to heartache or worse. Just like you don't want your emotions played with, neither do others. We're all on this earth together, so be straight and honest with each other.
Playing jokes about romance and emotion is unwise and has unintended consequences. This resonates with me because people take life for granted. They play with life and love as if they are immortal and that the consequences are not a thing to consider. The value that I'll take is that envy is an evil dressed as a joke. It destroys under the chuckle of laughter.
Nothing good comes from slander or the assassination of someone's character.
Claudio and Hero. How Claudio believes what others say to him over those who love him. He's easily manipulated and thinks with his emotions. That was me. I didn't do my homework. I was impulsive and easily manipulated. That story shows me my defective character and that I have to be vigilant of those negative characteristics. I have to be very mindful of those I associate with. There are a lot of people who prey on your weaknesses.
For me, it's the unforeseen consequences of your actions. I'm sure Don John didn't expect Hero to die, which made his devious plan go from a cruel prank to a severe mishap. My takeaway is that no matter the intentions, good or bad, a situation you make can always take a turn for the worse.
Claudio's story resonates with me so loudly because my insecurities have been played on once or twice. The people who know you are well versed in pulling your strings. It's that sticks and stones thing. The value here is to try not to let people in your world or space that are there to do you harm. In the past, I let so many people corrupt me. So reading Claudio's story, it reminds me to remain vigilant when it comes to destructive people, because I know the old me is always on the surface itching to get out. So I can't afford to let anyone pull my strings or deceive me in such a way that causes me to do harm.
Something that I took away from the story is that one false rumor can ruin so many lives in so many ways. Even the smallest of rumors, the more it is repeated by more and more mouths, can cause the biggest disaster.
That's just awesome, right?
I love this play, but I love these people. That was some good stuff right there.
Niki absolutely got that right. So let's leave that episode there with those words of wisdom, those sharings. All right. So with that done, let's do our one-word checkout. That is one word of how you are feeling right now. I'm throwing it to Niki.
Connected.
You stole my word. Connected. James?
I'm coming in with number 3. I am connected.
Yes. I feel it. I feel it in my soul. Just connected. We're so entwined and so connected. So I love that. So it looks like we're going to be going back in person. Yes. Oh my God. And with that, let's go ahead and we will clap it out. And ready? 1, 2, 3.
All right. Thank you to all of our readers. It was so great to have you with us. And goodbye to everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Great to be meeting everyone from all over.
Yes.
Bye-bye. Take care now. Stay safe.